Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In August 1990, the college town of Gainesville, Florida, was preparing for another ordinary fall semester. But within just 4 days, 5 young students would be brutally murdered in their own apartments, their bodies posed in horrific tableaus that would haunt investigators for years to come. The perpetrator would become known as the Gainesville Ripper, and his reign of terror would transform a vibrant university community into a town gripped by fear. Tonight, we'll explore how a drifter named Danny Rolling brought unimaginable horror to this peaceful college town, and the relentless investigation that finally brought him to justice. Let's begin. In the sweltering summer of 1990, the college town of Gainesville, Florida, was preparing for another academic year at the University of Florida. Students were moving into their apartments, parents were helping their children settle in, and the excitement of a new semester filled the air. No one could have predicted that this vibrant community was about to face one of the most horrific killing sprees in Florida's history. The terror began on Friday, August 24th, 1990, when the bodies of 17-year-old Christina Powell and her roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson, were discovered in their apartment at the Williamsburg Village complex. The crime scene was unlike anything local law enforcement had ever encountered. Both young women had been subjected to unspeakable violence. The killer had positioned their bodies in deliberately provocative poses, creating a grotesque tableau that would haunt investigators for years to come. Christina and Sonia were incoming freshmen, having arrived just days before to begin their college experience. They were found in their upstairs apartment after concerned friends noticed their absence. The perpetrator had managed to enter through a faulty ground floor window, climbing the stairs to where the victims slept. What made this crime particularly chilling was the level of organization and premeditation evident at the scene. The killer had used duct tape to restrain his victims and had taken the time to position them precisely as he wanted. Just 36 hours later, on August 26th, the body of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt was discovered in her apartment at the Gatorwood Apartments. Krista, a student at Santa Fe Community College, had been working as a records clerk for the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. The killer had waited for her to return from her evening shift, attacking her as she entered her apartment. The scene was even more horrific than the first double homicide, with the perpetrator displaying evidence of escalating violence and ritualistic behavior. The discovery of Krista's body sent shockwaves through the community. Not only was the crime scene particularly brutal, but the killer had taken the time to clean the victim's body and stage it in a manner that suggested he was taunting law enforcement. The fact that one of their own, albeit a civilian employee, had been targeted added another layer of horror to the unfolding nightmare. The pattern continued on August 27th, when Tracy Pauls and Manuel Taboada, both 23 years old, were found murdered in their apartment at the Gatorwood complex. Tracy and Manny, as he was known to friends, had been high school classmates in Miami. Manny, a hulking 6'3" former football player, had apparently tried to fight off the attacker, but even his size and strength weren't enough to prevent the tragedy. Within just 4 days, 5 young people had been brutally murdered. The killer's signature was becoming clear. He targeted young college students, primarily women, and demonstrated a level of organization that suggested this wasn't his first time committing violent crimes. The manner in which he staged his victims and the evidence he left behind, or rather, didn't leave behind, indicated someone with knowledge of police procedures. The Gainesville community was gripped by panic. The University of Florida delayed the start of classes. Students fled campus in droves, some never to return. Those who stayed traveled in groups, armed themselves with pepper spray and makeshift weapons, and barricaded their doors and windows at night. Local gun shops reported record sales, and security companies couldn't keep up with the demand for alarm systems. law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in Florida history. The task force included local police, sheriff's deputies, Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents, and FBI profilers. They worked around the clock, processing crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, and following up on thousands of leads. The investigation would eventually lead them to Danny Harold Rolling, a drifter from Shreveport, Louisiana. But at the time, investigators were dealing with numerous potential suspects, including a University of Florida freshman named Edward Humphrey, who had a history of erratic behavior and lived near the first crime scene. The pressure to make an arrest was immense, but investigators knew they needed to be thorough. They couldn't risk arresting the wrong person while the real killer remained free. As investigators dug deeper into the evidence, they began to piece together a profile of the killer. He was likely in his mid-30s, physically fit, and familiar with the area. The precision of his attacks suggested military training or experience with hunting. The criminal profilers noted that the positioning of the victims and other ritual aspects of the crimes indicated someone who fantasized about these acts long before carrying them out. What investigators didn't know at the time was that their perpetrator had already established a pattern of violence long before arriving in Gainesville. Danny Rolling had left a trail of destruction across the South, including a triple homicide in his hometown of Shreveport that would later help connect him to the Gainesville murders. Rolling had been arrested in Ocala, Florida, on September 8, 1990, for a supermarket robbery, just days after the Gainesville murders ended. He was using the alias Michael Kennedy at the time, and while in custody, he began to drop hints about his involvement in other crimes. But it would take months of careful investigation, DNA analysis, and the collection of additional evidence before authorities could definitively link him to the murders. The story of how Danny Rolling became the Gainesville Ripper began long before his arrival in Florida. His childhood in Shreveport was marked by severe abuse at the hands of his father, James Rolling, a police officer known for his explosive temper. Danny's mother, Claudia, later testified that James would regularly beat both her and their children, creating an atmosphere of constant terror in their home. This traumatic upbringing shaped Danny Rolling into a troubled young man who struggled with relationships and authority figures. He attempted to join the Air Force but was discharged after just a year for drug use. His marriage to Omatha Halco in 1974 ended in divorce 4 years later, and his subsequent relationships were marked by violence and instability. As investigators would later discover, Rolling's criminal career began long before the Gainesville murders. He had committed numerous burglaries and assaults, serving time in various prisons throughout the South. But it was a horrific crime in his hometown of Shreveport that would eventually help authorities understand the full scope of his violence. In November 1989, Rolling broke into the home of William Grissom, killing him, his daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean. The crime bore striking similarities to what would later occur in Gainesville: the careful planning, the positioning of victims, and the ritualistic elements that would become his signature. In the months following the Gainesville murders, as Rolling sat in custody for the Ocala supermarket robbery, investigators were meticulously building their case. The breakthrough came through DNA evidence, which was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations at the time. The killer had left biological evidence at 3 of the crime scenes, and advances in DNA technology allowed scientists to create a profile that would prove crucial to the investigation. While in custody, Rolling began to exhibit increasingly strange behavior. He started writing songs and poetry about murder and made drawings that contained disturbing imagery reminiscent of the crime scenes. He formed a peculiar friendship with another inmate, Bobby Lewis, to whom he began revealing details about the murders that only the killer could have known. Lewis would later become a key witness for the prosecution. Rolling's campsite, discovered in a wooded area near the University of Florida campus, provided investigators with a treasure trove of evidence. They found audio tapes where Rowling had recorded himself singing and talking about his crimes, along with tools that matched wounds on the victims. The site also contained personal items belonging to the victims, creating an ironclad connection between Rowling and the murders. Perhaps most chilling were the journals found at the campsite, in which Rowling had documented his thoughts and motivations. He wrote about wanting to become a superstar like Ted Bundy, who had murdered 2 Florida State University students in Tallahassee 12 years earlier. Rowling saw himself as a character in a horror movie, even referring to himself as Gemini because he believed he had multiple personalities. In June 1991, while still serving time for the robbery conviction, Rowling was finally charged with the 5 Gainesville murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Beyond the DNA matches, investigators had accumulated a wealth of physical evidence, including knife marks on the victims that matched tools found in his possession, fibers that linked him to the crime scenes, and his own incriminating statements. The similarities between the Gainesville murders and the unsolved Shreveport triple homicide became impossible to ignore. In both cases, the killer had carefully staged the crime scenes, used similar methods of entry, and demonstrated the same level of organization. Rowling would eventually confess to the Shreveport murders through his attorney, though he would never be tried for them due to the pending Florida charges. As the case moved toward trial, Rowling's defense team, led by public defenders Rick Parker and John Kearns, faced an uphill battle. The evidence against their client was substantial, and Rowling's background provided little in the way of mitigating circumstances that might generate sympathy from a jury. Even the argument that Rowling suffered from multiple personality disorder was undermined by psychiatric evaluations and the methodical nature of his crimes. On February 15, 1994, just as jury selection was about to begin, Rowling shocked the courtroom by pleading guilty to all charges. In a rambling statement to the court, he claimed that forces beyond his control had driven him to commit the murders. He spoke about his troubled past, his abusive father, and his desire to be a superstar. But he also demonstrated a chilling awareness of his actions, describing in detail how he had selected and stalked his victims. During the penalty phase of the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Rowling's calculated nature. They showed how he had carefully chosen his victims, primarily selecting young women who lived on ground floors or in easily accessible apartments. He would watch them for days, learning their routines before striking. This level of planning contradicted any claims of mental illness or loss of control. The testimony of the victims' families was particularly powerful. Christina Powell's mother spoke about finding her daughter's room exactly as she had left it, with unopened college textbooks still sitting on her desk. Krista Hoyt's father described how his daughter had wanted to follow in his footsteps in law enforcement. Manuel Taboada's family talked about how he had tried to protect Tracy Pauls, fighting to his last breath against their attacker. Rowling's own family testified about his troubled upbringing, but their accounts of abuse and neglect did little to outweigh the horror of his crimes. His mother, Claudia, described a household dominated by fear of James Rowling's violent outbursts, while his brother Kevin spoke about their father's brutal treatment of both children. However, as prosecutors pointed out, many people survive difficult childhoods without becoming serial killers. The evidence presented during the penalty phase also revealed Rowling's activities between the Shreveport and Gainesville murders. He had traveled across multiple states, committing robberies and burglaries to support himself. In each location, he would establish camps in wooded areas, much like the one found in Gainesville, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior that had been refined over time. On April 20, 1994, After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty for Danny Rolling. Judge Stan Morris concurred with their recommendation, sentencing Rolling to death for each of the 5 murders. The judge described the killings as conscienceless and unnecessarily torturous, noting that Rolling had demonstrated a clear pattern of premeditation and cruelty. During his years on death row at Florida State Prison, Rolling continued to attract attention through his artwork and writings. He created disturbing paintings and wrote poetry that he would sell through third parties, a practice that eventually led to Florida passing laws prohibiting inmates from profiting from their crimes. He also maintained correspondence with various people, including journalists and true crime enthusiasts, often providing conflicting accounts of his motivations. In 1997, Rolling collaborated with journalist Sondra London to publish The Making of a Serial Killer, the real story of the Gainesville murders. The book contained Rolling's own accounts of the crimes, along with his artwork and poetry. The publication sparked outrage among the victims' families and led to further legislation regarding criminals profiting from their notoriety. Perhaps most disturbing were Rolling's attempts to romanticize his crimes through his art and writing. He would often portray himself as a tragic figure, forced into violence by circumstances beyond his control. However, the careful planning and execution of his crimes told a different story, one of a calculated predator who took pleasure in causing pain and terror. As his execution date approached, investigators continued to explore Rolling's possible connection to other unsolved murders across the South. While he would occasionally hint at additional victims, he never made any definitive confessions beyond the Gainesville and Shreveport murders. The true extent of his crimes may never be known. On October 25, 2006, 16 years after the Gainesville murders, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. For his last meal, he requested lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. Before his execution, he sang a gospel song he had written, but offered no apologies to his victims' families. The effects of Rolling's crimes continue to reverberate through Gainesville and the University of Florida community. The murders fundamentally changed how the university approached student safety, leading to enhanced security measures that remain in place today. The tragedy also led to the creation of student escort services and improved campus lighting systems that have become models for other universities. The victims' families established scholarships and memorial funds in their loved ones' names, ensuring that Christina Powell, Sonia Larson, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manuel Taboada would be remembered not just as victims, but as young people whose lives held tremendous promise. Each year, these scholarships help new generations of students pursue their dreams that were tragically cut short for the 5 young people who lost their lives in August 1990. The Gainesville Ripper case also left its mark on law enforcement and forensic science. The successful use of DNA evidence, still a relatively new tool at the time, helped establish its importance in criminal investigations. The case is now studied at police academies and forensic schools as an example of how physical evidence, behavioral profiling, and traditional detective work can come together to solve complex crimes. The investigations task force model, which brought together local, state, and federal agencies, became a template for future major crime investigations. The collaboration between different law enforcement agencies, despite initial jurisdictional challenges, demonstrated the importance of unified response to serial offenders who often cross jurisdictional boundaries. Today, the sites of the murders have been renovated or rebuilt, but the memory of what happened there remains. Many Gainesville residents who lived through that terrible August still speak of how it changed their sense of security forever. the case serves as a sobering reminder of how one person's actions can devastate multiple communities and leave scars that never fully heal. The story of Danny Rolling and his victims also continues to influence popular culture, inspiring books, documentaries, and even horror films. However, those who remember the real events caution against sensationalizing the crimes, emphasizing instead the importance of remembering the victims and the lessons learned about campus safety and community vigilance. In the end, the Gainesville Ripper case remains one of Florida's most notorious criminal cases, not just for the brutality of the crimes, but for how it transformed a community. It demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature, the capacity for unfathomable evil, but also the resilience of a community that came together in the face of terror, the dedication of law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to bring justice, and the enduring strength of families who transformed their grief into positive action to help others. The legacy of this case serves as a reminder that while justice can be served, the impact of such crimes extends far beyond the courtroom. It lives on in improved safety measures, in changed laws, in memorial scholarships, and in the hearts of those who will never forget the 5 young lives that were so senselessly taken during that terrible summer in Gainesville.